Open almost any kitchen cabinet today, and you may find a small, private pharmacy hiding behind the cups and spices. Plastic bottles stand in rows. Capsules rattle inside amber containers. Labels promise immune support, digestive balance, energy, calm, recovery, focus, inflammation support, and everything else the modern body is told it might be missing. One bottle for the gut, one bottle for sleep, one bottle for stress, one bottle for the immune system, one more because someone online said turmeric was impossible to absorb without the right formula. The cabinet grows, slowly, almost without anyone noticing. First there are 2 bottles, then 5, then 10. Some are opened every morning, some expire half full. Others remain untouched because the routine became too complicated to remember. But long before wellness became a shelf of capsules, many households relied on something much simpler, a jar. Not a machine-made capsule, not a powdered blend, not a branded formula with a long list of claims, but a single jar filled with honey, vinegar, and herbs. At first glance, it does not look impressive. It looks almost too ordinary to matter. Golden honey clings to the sides of the glass. Vinegar thins it into a sharp, bright liquid. Dried leaves, roots, flowers, or spices float and slowly darken as the days pass. Yet this simple mixture belonged to one of the oldest preparation methods in herbal history. It was called an oxymel. The word comes from the old idea of combining sourness and sweetness, acid and honey, into a liquid that could carry the strength of plants in a form people could actually take. Bitter herbs became easier to swallow. Aromatic plants could infuse slowly. Roots and spices could release their color and sharpness into a medium that preserved them instead of letting them spoil. That is the part modern people often miss. The old question was not only which herb is useful. The deeper question was, how do we carry that herb into the body before it loses its strength? A dried capsule answers that question one way. It grinds the plant, seals it away, and makes the dose convenient. That convenience is powerful, and it is one reason capsules became so dominant. But the jar answered the question differently. It did not separate the herb from food, flavor, acidity, sweetness, preservation, and time. It brought all of those things together in one slow process. Honey did part of the work, vinegar did another, the herbs did another, and time allowed the mixture to become something different from the 3 ingredients that began inside the glass. This is why the phrase 3 ingredients can be misleading. It sounds too small. But the real ingredient is the transformation. A spoonful of honey by itself is sweet. Vinegar by itself is sharp. A dried herb by itself may be bitter, dusty, or difficult to take consistently. Combined and left to steep, they begin to behave as a system. The honey softens the harshness. The vinegar pulls brightness and bite from the plants. The herbs release their compounds gradually into the liquid, and after several days, the jar no longer smells like separate ingredients. It smells rounded, sharp, sweet, earthy, and alive with the memory of the plants inside it. This does not mean the jar replaces medicine. It does not mean every supplement on the shelf becomes useless. But it does raise a question that modern wellness rarely asks. If people once used food, herbs, preservation, and time as one connected method, why did that method disappear from everyday life? And why, after so many years of capsules and powders, are people beginning to look back at the old honey vinegar jar and realize that it was never primitive at all? To understand that, we have to look inside the mixture itself, not as a miracle, but as a small piece of kitchen chemistry that older generations understood through practice long before they had the language to explain it. The first thing to understand about this old jar is that honey was never just added for sweetness. In modern life, honey is often treated like a natural sugar, something stirred into tea or drizzled over breakfast. But in older preparation systems, it played a much more complex role. Honey was dense, low in water, naturally acidic, and chemically active enough to preserve many ingredients that would otherwise spoil quickly. That density mattered. When plant material entered honey, it did not enter an empty syrup. It entered a medium that resisted the growth of many unwanted organisms, held flavor tightly, and slowly pulled aromatic compounds from leaves, roots, flowers, and spices. This is one reason honey appears so often in older remedies and preserved foods. It made difficult plants easier to take. A bitter root became less aggressive. A sharp herb became smoother. Astringent leaves, which might be unpleasant as a dry powder, could become part of a balanced sweet-sour preparation when surrounded by honey and vinegar. But honey alone was only half of the method. The second ingredient, vinegar, changed the entire direction of the mixture. Vinegar brought acidity, and acidity does several things at once. It sharpens flavor, discourages many forms of spoilage, and helps pull certain compounds from plant material into the surrounding liquid. Where honey softened and preserved, vinegar opened and extracted. Together, they created a medium that was neither purely sweet nor purely sour. It was balanced between preservation and movement. This is what made oxymels so useful. They could hold herbs for a period of time while also drawing something out of them. The jar did not simply store the plant. It slowly translated the plant into liquid. That may sound poetic, but it is also practical. Many herbs are difficult to use consistently in their raw form. Some are too bitter. Some are too fibrous. Some lose aroma quickly when stored poorly. Others contain compounds that are easier to carry in liquid than in dry powder. The honey vinegar base solved several of these problems at once. It preserved. It extracted. It softened flavor. It made the preparation easier to take in small amounts. This is why the old method cannot be judged only by the standards of a modern capsule. A capsule is designed for measurement and convenience. It hides the taste, standardizes the serving, and allows the product to sit on a shelf for a long time without much visible change. That is useful, especially in a world that values speed and consistency. But a capsule also removes the herb from the process that once surrounded it. There is no sourness to stimulate the senses. There is no honey to carry flavor and soften bitterness. There is no slow infusion, where color, aroma, and plant chemistry move gradually into the liquid. The oxymel belongs to a different logic. It is not just an ingredient list. It is a preparation environment. And once herbs enter that environment, they begin to change. A handful of dried thyme, ginger, elderflower, rosemary, turmeric, sage, or any other chosen herb does not remain exactly the same after several days in honey and vinegar. The plant softens. The liquid darkens. Aromas rise from the jar when it is opened. Bitter notes become rounded, and sharp notes become clearer. The mixture becomes more than storage. It becomes extraction through time. This is the part that older households understood without needing laboratory language. They could see the color moving. They could smell the change. They could taste the difference between the first day and the seventh day. On the first day, the jar tastes like honey and vinegar with herbs floating inside. By the seventh day, the liquid tastes like the herbs have entered the body of the mixture. And that transformation is the reason the preparation survived for so long in traditional systems. It did not require machinery. It did not require a factory. It required only three things most households could understand: a sweet preservative, a sour extractor, and a plant worth carrying. But there is another layer to the story. Because when people today hear the word ferment, they often imagine probiotics, bubbling jars, living cultures, and dramatic claims about the gut. Some of that language comes from real biology, but some of it has been stretched too far. A honey vinegar herbal jar can be alive in certain conditions, especially when raw honey and unpasteurized vinegar are used. But it should not be treated as a guaranteed probiotic product with a predictable number of organisms in every spoonful. Its real value is more subtle. It sits between infusion, preservation, and fermentation. That middle ground is what makes it interesting, because over several days, the jar does not simply hold the ingredients, it changes their relationship to one another. The herbs surrender color and aroma. The vinegar becomes less harsh, the honey becomes less heavy. The liquid becomes easier to take, easier to remember, and easier to integrate into daily life than a collection of separate powders and pills. And once we understand that, the old jar begins to look less like a folk curiosity and more like a carefully balanced technology of the kitchen. Not modern technology, not industrial technology, but a household technology built from flavor, chemistry, preservation, and patience. The next question is what actually changes during those 7 days, and why time itself may be the ingredient modern supplement cabinets often leave out. On the first day, the jar is still easy to understand. There is honey, there is vinegar, there are herbs. Each ingredient still seems separate, almost as if the mixture has not yet made a decision about what it wants to become. The honey clings to the spoon. The vinegar rises sharply into the nose. The herbs float stubbornly, dry and light, still carrying the texture of the shelf they came from. But time begins changing that separation. During the first 24 hours, the herbs slowly absorb liquid and lose their dry stiffness. Leaves unfold. Roots darken. Spices release color from their broken surfaces. The honey loosens as it blends with vinegar, and the vinegar begins losing its raw edge as plant compounds move into the liquid. By the third or fourth day, the jar usually smells different. The sourness is still there, but it has become less empty. The sweetness is still present, but it no longer feels separate from the herbs. Aromatic compounds that were trapped inside dried plant tissue begin appearing in the liquid, and the preparation develops the deeper scent of something that has been allowed to settle into itself. This is not the same as swallowing a dry powder. A capsule can carry ground herbs into the body, but it cannot recreate this transformation before it is swallowed. It does not soften bitterness in honey. It does not expose the plant to acidity for days. It does not allow flavor, aroma, and soluble compounds to move gradually into a liquid medium. That difference matters because herbs are not single-ingredient machines. A plant is not one compound. It is a network of compounds. Aromatic oils, acids, bitter principles, minerals, pigments, tannins, resins, and polyphenols. Some dissolve more easily in water. Some respond better to acidity. Some are carried more pleasantly through sweetness. Some become noticeable only after time has pulled them from the plant tissue. The old jar works because it does not ask the herb to behave like a pill. It gives the herb an environment. That environment is especially important when we think about plants like turmeric, ginger, rosemary, thyme, sage, elderberry, or hibiscus. Each one has its own chemistry and its own character, and none of them becomes useful simply because it has been ground into dust and sealed away. Turmeric is a good example, but it must be used carefully. Modern research often points out that curcumin, one of turmeric's famous compounds, has poor bioavailability on its own. This is why people combine turmeric with fat, black pepper, heat, or specialized formulations designed to help the body handle it more effectively. A honey vinegar ferment does not magically solve that problem. It does not turn turmeric into a pharmaceutical extract. And it should not be advertised as if it outperforms every supplement on the shelf. But it does reveal the larger lesson. Preparation matters. The form in which a plant is taken can change how it tastes, how consistently people use it, and how its compounds are carried into the body. That was the old intelligence behind preparations like oxymels. They were not just about the herb, they were about the delivery system. 7 days gives the mixture time to become that delivery system. It gives the acid time to extract. It gives the honey time to soften. It gives the plant material time to release what it can release. And if raw honey or unpasteurized vinegar is used, it may also allow a modest living process to develop, though that process is variable and should not be reduced to a guaranteed probiotic count. This is where the modern internet often exaggerates the story. It wants the jar to be stronger than every capsule, more alive than every probiotic, and more bioavailable than every supplement formula. But the real story is more interesting because it is more believable. The jar does not need to defeat the cabinet. It simply shows that the cabinet is incomplete. A shelf of capsules may contain measured ingredients, but it usually removes the sensory and biological context that older preparations used as part of the method. The taste, the acidity, the sweetness, the aroma, and the waiting period were not decorations. They were part of how people made herbs usable. By the 7th day, the oxymel is no longer just honey, vinegar, and herbs sitting together. It is a joined preparation. The liquid carries the color of the plants. The sharpness of the vinegar has been rounded by honey. The herbs have given part of themselves to the mixture. And the person who opens the jar can understand the change immediately, not from a label, but from the smell rising out of the glass. That kind of preparation does not fit neatly into the modern supplement world. It changes from batch to batch. It depends on the honey, the vinegar, the herb, the temperature, the jar, and the hands that made it. It is personal, variable, and alive with small differences. And that is exactly why the next part of the story matters. Because the reason this method faded was not simply that people forgot it. It faded because the modern world became better at selling things that never change. The modern supplement cabinet did not appear by accident. It grew because capsules solved problems that older preparations could never solve easily. A capsule could be measured. It could be labeled. It could be shipped across countries, stored in warehouses, placed on pharmacy shelves, and sold with the promise that every serving would be nearly identical to the last. That kind of consistency changed everything. A jar of honey, vinegar, and herbs could not compete with it on industrial terms. One jar might be stronger because the herbs were fresher. Another might be milder because the vinegar was different. One batch might steep in a warm kitchen, while another sat in a cool pantry and changed more slowly. From a household perspective, those differences were normal. From an industrial perspective, they were a problem. Modern wellness became organized around products that could be standardized, sealed, counted, and repeated. Capsules fit that world perfectly because they removed taste, smell, texture, and waiting from the process. They made herbs portable and convenient. And for many people, that convenience was genuinely useful. But something was lost in the exchange. The herb became an isolated ingredient. The preparation disappeared. Instead of honey, vinegar, plant material, acidity, sweetness, aroma, and thyme working together, the modern consumer often received a dry powder in a small shell, separated from the older context that once made herbal use part of daily kitchen life. This does not mean the capsule is useless. It means the capsule is only one answer. The old jar answered a different question. It asked how a household could preserve herbs, soften bitterness, extract flavor, and make a preparation that people would remember to use. Because it belonged to the rhythm of the kitchen, rather than the discipline of a pill schedule. That is why the return of oxymels today feels less like a trend and more like a rediscovery. People are not only searching for another supplement, they are searching for a process they can understand with their senses. They want to see the color deepen, smell the herbs entering the liquid, taste the balance shifting from separate sweetness and sourness into something joined. A capsule asks for trust in a label. A jar asks for attention, and attention changes how people relate to what they consume. Still, this is where the story has to remain honest. A honey vinegar herbal ferment is not suitable for everyone, and it should never be presented as a replacement for medicine, prescribed nutrients, or clinical treatment. Honey is not safe for infants under 1 year old. People managing blood sugar need to treat honey-based preparations carefully. Vinegar can aggravate reflux, ulcers, or dental enamel if used undiluted or too often. Herbs can interact with medications, and homemade ferments may not be appropriate for people with compromised immune systems. The old method deserves respect, not exaggeration. A clean jar matters. Good ingredients matter. Dried herbs are often safer and more predictable than fresh herbs because they carry less water into the mixture. The herbs should stay submerged. Any mold, rotten odor, strange growth, or pressure buildup is assigned to discard the batch rather than rescue it. This is not fear. It is the same practical caution that kept older household preparations alive for generations. People who worked with food. And fermentation understood that life in a jar could be useful, but only when handled with care. A simple oxymel does not need to be complicated. Honey and vinegar are combined in a clean jar. Dried herbs are added and kept beneath the liquid. The jar is covered loosely if gas may build, stirred or shaken gently, and allowed to sit for several days until the liquid takes on the color and aroma of the plants. Then it is strained, stored, and used in small, diluted amounts as a food-based preparation, not as a medical dose. That distinction protects the whole story, because the real value of the oxymel is not that it makes every supplement obsolete. It is that it reminds us how narrow modern wellness can become when it is reduced only to pills, powders, and labels. Before cabinets filled with bottles, there were kitchen shelves filled with processes. Ferments, infusions, broths, vinegars, syrups, teas, preserves. Each one was a way of carrying the useful parts of plants through time, turning fragile ingredients into something that could last long enough to become part of daily life. The oxymel belongs to that older world. It stands at the meeting point between food and herb, sweetness and acid, preservation and extraction. It is not primitive because it is simple. It is simple because it solves several problems at once. And perhaps that is why it still feels strangely modern when someone makes it today. A person places honey in a jar, adds vinegar, drops in herbs, waits. Nothing about the process looks dramatic. There is no capsule machine, no laboratory coating, no branded promise printed across a label. But over the next several days, the liquid changes. The herbs darken, the smell deepens, the sharpness softens. The jar becomes something more coherent than its separate parts. And when it is placed back on the kitchen shelf, beside the mugs, the spices, and the bottles that modern life has taught us to depend on, it carries a quiet reminder. Wellness was not always a cabinet of products. Sometimes it was a preparation. Sometimes it was a relationship between plants, preservation, taste, and time. And sometimes 3 ordinary ingredients left alone for 7 days can reveal how much older knowledge was waiting inside the kitchen all along.